أهلا وسهلا فيكم أعزائي المشاهدين. تنظم أسرة دار الآثار الإسلامية العديد من المحاضرات في موسمها الجديد 2019-2020، محاضرات منها في اللغة العربية ومنها في اللغة الإنجليزية. تابعونا، خلينا نستمتع معاكم في محاضرة اليوم.
Thank you very much indeed. Can you all hear? So tonight's lecture has probably the longest title that you're likely to see, and I make no real apology for that, because I hope you'll find the conclusions interesting, but I'm not pretending that the journey will be easy. So, I'm going to be talking about people and place. So let me introduce you to the people. Let's start with the great leaders, if you like, the ones who got their noses in front. Separated by 1100 years, on the left you have Constantine the Great, the Roman emperor, who was also the first Christian emperor. And he was the founder of the city that bore his name, Constantinople. On the right, you have the Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed the Conqueror, Mehmed Fatih, who on the 29th of May, 1453, realized the long-held dream of Islam to capture Constantinople. In 1453, that city was in a sorry, depleted state, but it still held sway over the imagination as one of the greatest cities of the world, a capital of the once proud Byzantine Empire, a city known as the New Rome. Now let's turn to two more people. On the right is the last Byzantine emperor of Constantinople, fatalistically also called Constantine. He wasn't Constantine the First, but Constantine the 11th. He's the one who was killed by Mehmed's troops. And on the left, Musa Cerantonio. He's an Australian for whom Constantinople is a city of dreams and imaginings. Raised as a Catholic, he converted to Islam at the age of 17. He was, perhaps still is, one of the historians most read by foreign fighters for ISIS in Syria and Iraq. But before we begin to tease out the links between our four, I have to tell you about place. You're all familiar with Istanbul. Constantinople, as depicted 30 years before Mehmed conquered it. Depopulated, ruinous, but with some of the greatest buildings in the world. Above all, the Church of Hagia Sophia, the Hippodrome, and here the Church of the Holy Apostles. Situated, though you can't see it on this, on the highest hill in the city. We'll come to them all in good time. Here, 30 years after the fall, after the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople, this print projected an image of a city bustling with commerce. All around it are ships. It's a city graced with major new imperial constructions. There's Mehmed's first palace in the center of the city. There's his other palace, known to you all as the Topkapı Saray. And there is his great mosque. One can still see Hagia Sophia, this rather peculiarly shaped building here, and the Hippodrome over here. and the imperial columns of the early Byzantine city. But there is no sign of the holy apostles. What had happened? Let's go back to when Mehmed, a youth of 21, captured the city. Now, as was custom, he offered the Byzantines the opportunity to surrender. If they'd accepted, they would have retained their churches and their right to reside. But they refused. They were killed or enslaved. Mehmed allowed his victorious troops 3 days of plunder, but on the understanding that the movable items were theirs, immovable items, buildings and so forth, his. Now, Islamic law and Ottoman practice dictated that the Christians lose their rights and their churches would be appropriated because they had refused the opportunity to surrender. But that's not exactly what happened. And in the 16th century, Ottoman jurists were left somewhat puzzled. Now, Hagia Sophia, was taken over by the Ottomans, and Mehmed turned it into the city's major mosque, until 10 years later, he built his own mosque. The puzzling question is what happened to the Church of the Holy Apostles? You all know Hagia Sophia well, a building constructed by the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, but with a dome so large and beauteous that it still amazes us today. But the Holy Apostles? You probably don't know. You may never have heard of it. Why? Because it disappeared. But let's try to imagine it. Here in a miniature from about 1125 to 1150, a Byzantine miniature, we can see something of an attempt to show its lustrous beauty. Now, this church, the Holy Apostles, was originally built by Constantine, the founder of Constantinople. It was then completely rebuilt by the person who built Hagia Sophia, Justinian. Now, Justinian's Holy Apostles was not only the second most important church in the city, it was, and please remember this, the imperial pantheon. It was the burial place of Constantine himself and the first 11 emperors and many more. We can conjure up an image of this building because it was the model for a building many of you may know well, the Basilica of San Marco in Venice. That building has changed over time, so I show you here a mosaic from the 15th century that shows you San Marco before it received all of its Gothic flourishes. And you can see the relationship between the buildings. Just to give you a further sense of what the Holy Apostles might have felt like, let's see inside the domes and mosaics of San Marco in Venice. Now, what happened to the Holy Apostles after the conquest of Constantinople in 1453 is at first puzzling. In 1454, 7 months after the capture of the city, Mehmed did something extraordinary. He installed a new Greek religious patriarch as the head of not only of the Greek Orthodox Church, but the entire Greek community. He granted him the Church of the Holy Apostles to be the seat of the Patriarchate. Yet a little under 10 years later, In the early 1460s, the church was demolished and a great mosque built. What a difference, you might say, a decade makes. Let's try and understand that gift. We can easily appreciate why Mehmed granted the patriarch a church. Head of a religious community had to have a church. But to grant him a church so intimately connected to the rituals and image of Byzantine imperial rule amazed the Greek community. The reason was realpolitik. For all the image of triumphalism, Mehmed's position immediately before and immediately after the conquest of Constantinople was precarious. There was strife amongst his viziers, with a pro-Greek faction and an anti-Greek faction. Although Mehmed eventually executed the leader of the pro-Greek faction, Mehmed needed the support of the Greeks to repopulate the city. Why? He invited Muslims to come to his new city, but few of them wished to abandon cities like Bursa, wished to abandon their homes for the uncertainties of a pillaged city under the shadow of a new Latin crusade. So when persuasion failed, Mehmed adopted forced settlement. He obliged people to come. But he needed more people. So to become a magnet for the Greek Orthodox, he selected not a secular but a religious leader of the community, Scholarios. Here's a digital reconstruction of what the Holy Apostles might have looked like. Rather gloomy reconstruction, but imagine that with a little more of the effulgence of that miniature I showed you. Now, I would suggest that giving the Greek patriarch, the Holy Apostles, was a price he had to pay. But his gesture was highly symbolic, because while he appropriated Hagia Sophia for Islam, he was effectively re-establishing the Holy Apostles for Christ. It was a declaration that the Greeks were to be partners, albeit minority partners, in the new polity that he was creating. Yet almost immediately, Mehmed regained possession of the Holy Apostles. After less than 6 months, Scholarios asked the Sultan to take the Church of the Holy Apostles back. By all accounts, including Gennadios' own words, the building was in a terrible condition, huge and unmanageable, and the patriarch and his brethren appeared to have been scared when a corpse was found in the precinct of the church. So the patriarch asked Mehmed's permission to move to a small convent. Please note that Mehmed did not demand the church back. It was returned to him. And if we think about this from the Greek side, to give back the Holy Apostles was to abandon the most potent focus of Byzantine imperial memory still in Greek hands. For Mehmed, it ultimately gave him the opportunity to redevelop the site of the Holy Apostles. Now, that was in the 1450s. In the 1460s, time was very different. In the 1460s, Mehmed could begin to see the fruits of his strenuous campaigning. He'd secured the Balkans. He'd removed the last remnants of Byzantine secular power in Greece and on the Black Sea. He'd moved his capital from Edirne to Istanbul, and he spent several years there free of campaigns. In fact, he suffered from ill health in the mid-1460s, and that gave him an opportunity to oversee the many building projects he'd initiated. These included what we saw in that earlier print, the construction of his new palace, the Topkapı Saray, and of course his mosque. And his officers were building prodigiously. His city was finally becoming populous. So from the early 1460s, Mehmed put his stamp on the city. In 1453, when he granted Scholarius the Holy Apostles, there was a fragility about Mehmed's Istanbul project. 10 years later, Mehmed devoted his full energies and resources to realizing his vision. Replacing the Holy Apostles, the symbol of Byzantine imperial longevity, replacing it with a mosque, was the ultimate fruit of victory. So now let's turn to that mosque. Now, there at the top from the 1550s, you see an image of what Mehmed's mosque looked like. Unfortunately, in 1765, there was a massive earthquake, and the mosque was entirely rebuilt. And there from the 1890s is a photograph of what it looks like, and it looks like that pretty much today. I say it was completely rebuilt, but there was one section that wasn't rebuilt, and that's the courtyard, and that's of enormous importance to what I'm going to talk about in a moment. Now, before I show you the mosque in any detail, I want to emphasize that this isn't a mosque in isolation. He built an enormous site, an area 320 meters square. It's actually quite difficult to imagine. There's the mosque, the courtyard, his own tomb, and the tomb of the mother of the future Sultan, Bayezid II. This was completely flanked by a huge enclosure with 8 madrasas on either side, and then corresponding smaller madrasas there and there. And here on the southern side, there were 3 sections, the hospital, a garden, and then a guest house and hospices. This was one of the largest mosque complexes in the Islamic world. It was unparalleled in size and symmetry. It was, in Evliya Çelebi's words, like a town of lead-covered domes. Its population, the equivalent of a small town. And there's the mosque. Now, the mosque essentially had a very large dome for the time, but only one semi-dome. And then it was supported up here by these large piers, and then by 2 porphyry columns that I'll mention in a moment. I could at this point introduce yet another character, though I don't have a portrait of him, and that's the architect. He was a convert to Islam whom Mehmed rewarded with land and the title of imperial architect. And then, after reward, came punishment. He tortured him, he imprisoned him, and the poor architect died in the prison. Something to do with those porphyry columns. But if we go into that, it will lead us astray. Effectively, Mehmed's mosque was slightly unstable and ungainly. And unlike Hagia Sophia, it didn't have a pair of semi-domes, just the one. Now, only the courtyard remains from the original 15th century construction. As I said, the prayer hall completely rebuilt in the 18th century. The declaration in the inscriptions is absolutely clear. This is about the triumph over Constantinople, with a hadith of the Prophet that blesses the leader who captures that city. In contrast, the Holy Apostles doesn't get a mention, and it hardly gets mentioned in the Ottoman chronicles either. Barely a passing mention in European sources. So what we see is that Hagia Sophia's preservation contrasts with the destruction of the Holy Apostles. So the question I have is, was the Holy Apostles nothing more than a site to be cleared on the top of the highest point in Istanbul? Or did the site resonate for Mehmed as a lieu de mémoire? So I think here the critical question is, does Fatih Jami, does Mehmed's mosque, stand on the site of the Holy Apostles or just in its approximate neighborhood? In 2000, a German scholar, Albrecht Berger, argued, and I quote, "If the mosque had replaced the church exactly, the grave of Sultan Mehmed would have taken the place of Constantine's mausoleum. This would have been an act of enormous symbolic meaning." Berger dismisses the idea as, quote, "a modern projection backward in time." Things, though, may not be quite so simple. I'm going to show you a wonderfully confusing plan by a German scholar from the 1930s. What we find is that most scholars have tended to assume that the mosque was built near but not on the church. But one scholar, Karl Wunsinger, made a detailed proposal that Mehmed's mosque lies exactly on top of the Holy Apostles. And he developed this plan by looking first at what the Holy Apostles might have looked like by modeling it after another church built by Justinian on the model of the Holy Apostles, a church in Ephesus. He then superimposed onto that two further plans, one of what Mehmed's mosque might have looked like in the 15th century, and then what it looked like in the 18th century. I scratch my head, but basically nobody followed Wulsinger at all. Wulsinger explicitly assumed that Mehmed's architects would have tried to use the pre-existing foundations rather than build everything anew. In other words, he saw what Mehmed was doing largely as a practical solution. Use somebody else's foundations. And scholars have taken little account of Wulsinger's suggestion because there was no trace of a monument prior to Fatih Jami. Wulsinger admitted this. But is that the case? Now, in 2002 and 2013, two scholars, Ken Dark and Feridun Özgümüş, drew attention to some distinctive features they say are earlier than the courtyard of Mehmed's mosque. A courtyard, you remember, that dates to the 15th century. So, pre-15th century features. Now, amazingly, their work has been almost entirely dismissed. I think that's quite unfair, and I want us to take a closer look. There are up to 3 courses of huge stones, very large, heavily eroded ashlar, that form the visible base of the courtyard walls. And even from this slide, you can tell that these are of a different stone, size, condition, and finish to Mehmed's masonry above. Other details like evidence that there were further courses, iron bars, and so forth. Now, if Wulsinger's plan was rather confusing, Ken Dark's is as direct as it could be. Now, what I want you to concentrate on are these areas in red, because those areas are, he says, where we find those larger ashlar that I just showed you a moment ago that seem to predate. On the left, you see section A, and you can see it these protruding. Here we have AB, just by the cemetery section, and you can see how far they protrude. Here we have AC, this section here on the east side. There's a section by the steps. And then on the other side of the cemetery, another section of something going on. And you can see that actually the top section isn't bonded into the bottom. So they are of different periods. Briefly, the whole thing seems to have been raised on a very high platform. Those kind of high platforms are not common. They occur in a couple of places. In one place where they appear, in the Blue Mosque, the Sultan Ahmed Jami, we know that it was over the ruins of the Byzantine palace. If we look at Bayezid's mosque, the mosque built by Mehmed's son, you can see it's not raised up high on a big platform. There are gigantic steps. They don't align properly. I'm not going to go into details, but just... And then there are plinths that are very peculiar. We have nothing quite like them in Ottoman architecture. Clearly a base for the minarets, but they didn't need to be this large. And the last feature is platforms. And outside the mosque, there are these enormous platforms that you can see in this aerial view here. No other mosque has something similar. Can we explain these anomalies? Okay, I think we can. But before coming to that, I just want to introduce you to something extraordinary. It is one of the first surviving architectural plans from the Muslim world. And I'm calling it the unexecuted plan, because it wasn't exactly how the Fatih Jami, the Mehmed's mosque, was built. So there it is up here. And what I've done here is to overlay the built plan over the first idea. So I'm going to call this the unexecuted plan, and not because the architect was executed, but I'll call the 15th century one in grey the executed plan. Now, notice that in the 15th century drawing for the unexecuted plan, the steps were huge, but they don't quite align with the current ones. And notice too that there's a whole section here that was longer. And that section corresponds exactly to where those big platforms were outside the current mosque courtyard. In other words, the intention was to build something that incorporated those big platforms we saw a moment ago. So how does this relate to Justinian's church? There have been many attempts to reconstruct Justinian's church, but a wonderful study by Nikolaos Karidis recently is, I think everybody recognizes, the most authoritative that's been done so far. Now, if we look at it, you could see four arms that are more or less the same width. Notice these lines here. If the Church of the Holy Apostles was built on the site of the present mosque, those red lines do not correspond. There's a huge gap between this wall and this. And I'm going to come and explain that in a moment. Then notice here the dotted lines of where Karidis believes Constantine's tomb was. If we take that building, Justinian's building, and place it over a plan of Mehmed's mosque in the 15th century, can you see how these transept arms correspond to the enormous steps that were built? Look at the plan of the Holy Apostles and compare it to the unexecuted plan here. you can see that there's a section here that is missing from this plan. But that's because Caridis does not include what we know was eventually there, which was a porch. So my belief is that there was a porch here, and those big platforms we were looking at earlier correspond to that section. But we still have the problem of the gap between the bits of masonry that we were looking at earlier and the walls of Justinian's church. So I'm going to take you to Italy, to two buildings built in the mid-11th century. San Sabino in Canosa, built in the 1050s, and San Marco, which was remodeled in the 1060s and 1070s. Now, interestingly, we know that both of them looked to the Holy Apostles as the model, and they did so independently. If we lay a plan of Justinian's Holy Apostles over San Marco, you can see how well that fits with the transept arms here. But San Marco has added in galleries here and some buildings here. If we look to see how it corresponds to Mehmed's mosque, you can see how well it fits. That these protrusions here that explain the enormous steps correspond to the walls here that we were looking at earlier. And if we go to Canosa, what do we find? Arms that protrude and a much wider section here. So what had happened was that people have been making the mistake of comparing Justinian's building, and actually what they should be doing is looking at the remodeling of that building in the 9th century by the Emperor Basil, when he added, I believe, galleries around it. So now we can explain that it was Justinian's building that created this extraordinary sections in the Mehmed's mosque, and it was Basil's building that took these walls out to where we see the remnants. He acquired the Christian relics and the imperial sarcophagi. He gathered these in his palaces. The sarcophagi, of which you see an example here, were not removed as building material. Of the 10 imperial porphyry sarcophagi, the most valuable stone in the ancient world, we know that there were 10 of them in the Holy Apostles. 8 are still extant, and the remaining 2 can be accounted for. And most of these were found in the Topkapi Palace or in his first palace. In other words, Mehmed deliberately removed them. He did not destroy them. And they became the outdoor equivalent of the Christian religious relics that Mehmed also assembled in the Topkapi Palace. And here we have a list drawn up for his son Bayezid in 1489, listing 21 Christian relics, ranging from the stone on which Christ was allegedly born to the bodies of the prophet Isaiah and many others. This was an extraordinary accumulation. So Christian relics and imperial sarcophagi bear witness to Mehmed's keen appreciation of imperial propaganda and historical symbolism. I have no doubt at all that he fully grasped the significance of burying the Church of the Holy Apostles under his mosque and Constantine's mausoleum, and thus the mausoleum of the first 11 emperors, under his mihrab. So let me conclude. 1453, Mehmed's victory realized a dream that the Dar al-Islam had harbored for 800 years, the capture of Constantinople. But Mehmed could not actualize his vision for the city until a decade later, when he embarked on his major architectural campaign. In 1453, preserving Hagia Sophia was testament to triumph, achieved through adaptation, not destruction. Granting the holy apostles to the patriarch was a symbol of accommodation. That was to change. And in 1462-3, the holy apostles was erased to make way for Mehmed's mosque. Fatih Jami, as it came to be known, became the most abiding symbol of the new order. The mihrab of Mehmed's mosque was over the site of Constantine's tomb, the founder of the new Constantinople, triumphant over the founder of the first Constantinople. Continuity was averred by maintaining the name of the city, Constantinia, Constantinople. That was how it was referred to in Mehmed's coinage and continued to be referred to in Ottoman imperial coinage for just under 500 years. But the city's popular name was Istanbul, and it's fitting that Mehmed is said to have quipped that Istanbul had become Islambul, full of Islam. For he created not only its crowning mosque, but an entire educational city devoted to the training of a religious and legal class. Mehmed's vision was of a city that contained echoes of Constantinople's past, but was above all a living witness to Islam. I think that's perfectly expressed in the designs for tapestries that the Flemish artist Peter Kuker van Aalst made for Suleiman the Magnificent in the 1530s. Here we see Sultan Suleiman framed against the hippodrome, against the backdrop of the theatre of ancient empire. But his trajectory is clear because his cavalcade is heading towards the north, towards the great mosque that sits at the highest point on the horizon. That was the mosque of Suleiman's great-grandfather, Mehmed the Conqueror. This was Fatih Jami, built over the remains of Byzantium's second greatest church and principal imperial necropolis. Mehmed's mosque was the herald of a new dispensation. Mehmed's mosque was the triumph of Islam written in stone. Thank you very much.
وصلنا معكم أعزائي المشاهدين إلى ختام هذه الندوة المتميزة. أشكر كل من يعمل على قدم وساق لإنجاح مثل هذه الندوات والمحاضرات. أحب أقول لكم أن المحاضرات والندوات مستمرة في دار الآثار الإسلامية وتحديدا في مركز اليرموك الثقافي كل يوم اثنين من 7 إلى 8. حياكم الله. الدعوة عامة، تعالوا خلونا نستمتع معاكم في هذا الشيء الراقي والمتميز.